Welcome back to the True Crime series, where the thrilling stories not only make you shiver, but also make you cling to your seat like watching a dramatic crime movie. If in the previous part we had to live in the obsession of Zodiac letters and terrifying codes, then in part 3, our biggest question will be asked: who is the Zodiac Killer? The story of Zodiac does not stop at brutal murders or letters full of codes. On the contrary, he also left an invisible trace, a list of countless suspects, names that every time they are mentioned, people have to ask a big question. Could it be him? Each suspect in the Zodiac case has their own mysteries, inexplicable connections, and vague traces that make both the police and the public have headaches. But no one knows that, among those names, there may be someone who has been living in the shadows of society, continuing to hide, challenging justice. In this part 3, we will go through the most prominent names on the Zodiac suspect list, from strange neighbors, mysterious veterans to those with alibis but who make people suspicious. The truth is still unclear, but the deeper we delve into the suspicions, the more clearly we see that Zodiac is still the name that haunts the whole of America and the world. So who is the one who created the horror not only through guns, but also through the intelligence and formidable intelligence in controlling the media and the public? Let's follow along, because this story will not stop until all the doubts are answered, or maybe until we realize that Zodiac is truly an uncatchable ghost, an evil that still exists in the heart of society. And don't worry, if you don't know who the Zodiac Killer is, don't miss it, because in the next part, we will together open the story of strange suspects and mysterious clues. Zodiac Killer. The name has become a symbol of inexplicable crimes. But when a case becomes a legend, it also attracts countless eyes from the public, the media, and, inevitably, the suspects. No case is as mysterious and obscure as the Zodiac case, with countless hypotheses, clues, and names mentioned in the hunt for the killer. During the years of investigation, the police have identified many suspects, each with their own story, a strange personality, and faint traces, making it impossible for them to leave this game, officially or not. But when looking back, one thing is clear. In the hunt for Zodiac, not all suspects are clearly suspicious. Some were people who behaved strangely. Others were simply alibiless at the time of the murders, while others were too perfect to ignore. The question is, was the Zodiac really intentional? Or was it all just a coincidence in a psychological game he played? And among these suspects, is there anyone who is the killer who has become a symbol of fear and mystery? The name Arthur Leigh Allen is the one that comes up most often in discussions about the Zodiac. Allen, a man who lived in Vallejo at the time of the murders, has long been a suspect. Allen is a strange man with a troubled past, having been accused of sexual assault but never convicted. It all started when several witnesses said they saw a man who looked like Allen near the scene of the murders. Allen also possessed suspicious features, such as a round watch shaped like the Zodiac symbol and an old car, similar in style to the one used by Zodiac in the murders. However, what was more remarkable was that Allen had a special hobby. He loved cryptography and had created his own codes, just like Zodiac. It could be said that Arthur Leigh Allen was the most likely suspect when considering the strange coincidences. But then, like many other cases in history, the concrete evidence was not strong enough to conclude that he was the Zodiac. The police were unable to find solid evidence, despite DNA testing and years of investigation. Still, many people believe Allen is the killer, and some in the public and media continue to associate Allen with the Zodiac case because of the uncanny resemblance between his actions and the way Zodiac described himself. Some even argue that if Allen is not the Zodiac, he is at least part of the story. In the eyes of those who have followed the case, Allen is the one you never forget once you see him. But one thing is undeniable. Although suspicions about Allen have never subsided, he is still not the Zodiac. The final culprit. Another suspect, Richard Gaikowski, is a lesser-known name, but one that has intrigued investigators. Gaikowski was a journalist who worked for the San Francisco Examiner, where the first letters from the Zodiac were received. Gaikowski had a peculiar personality and lived a life that matched the details of the Zodiac letters. He was a recluse, had little communication, and liked to isolate himself from society, traits that fit the description of the Zodiac. It is worth noting that Gajkowski was said to have been present at many of the crime scenes, although there was no clear evidence to convict him. However, the strange coincidence in time and space made many people suspicious. Investigators collected many documents about Gajkowski, including articles he wrote, but found nothing solid enough to conclude that he was the Zodiac. Interestingly, after the Zodiac case faded into obscurity, Gajkowski continued his work as a journalist, seemingly unaffected by the suspicion surrounding him. Gajkowski died in 2004, but his name lives on in the Zodiac conversation. Some believe that if anyone is a suspect, it is Gajkowski, but like all the other suspects in the case, he is just one of a long list of names that have never been confirmed. Still, with the mystery surrounding him, Gajkowski's name continues to be mentioned in the Zodiac debate. However, one of the suspects that the public and the police have never really forgotten is that he is someone who no one can imagine. Zodiac is not an easy person to identify. He may be an ordinary person, just dangerous in nature. Certainly, there are some people who have been suspected because of their unusual characteristics and behaviors, but no direct evidence has been found. Zodiac is the model of someone who knows how to evade the law, someone who knows how to play cat and mouse. One of the popular theories is that Zodiac could be a very ordinary person working in a nondescript field, maybe a bank employee, a civil servant, or even someone the public would not suspect. He could be an unremarkable person, just a mental terrorist who is good at hiding in the crowd. And so, even though there are many suspects, we still cannot be sure who is behind the name Zodiac. So, we have seen that each suspect has his own story. Each clue leads to a different turn in the search for Zodiac. But is there really anyone who is the killer? There are still many mysteries. And in Zodiac Killer Mystery, Suspects and Clues True Crime Documentary, Part 3, we will delve deeper into the clues, the odd suspects, and the unanswered questions. Was Zodiac really caught? Or has he been on the run for decades? Don't miss it, because in Part 3, we will discover more details that have never been revealed. And who knows, we will get closer to the final truth. As the Zodiac began to surface with his bloody letters and bizarre codes, the American public was drawn into a dangerous game that they could not stop. Not only the police, but also society were drawn into his game. Every clue, every theory led to a different suspect, and there seemed to be no definitive conclusion. To this day, no one has been convicted in the Zodiac case, and suspicions have persisted for years. But the scary thing is, were the suspects really involved in the cases, or was the Zodiac just challenging everything from the shadows? Suspect 4, Lawrence Kane, the Strange Man. One of the suspects that has been controversial for many years is Lawrence Kane, a man who lived in San Francisco in the 1960s. Kane had a criminal history and matched the descriptions of some of the victims. He was also an employee at a hotel where the Zodiac is said to have stayed during those years. One of the notable details is that Kane had a complicated relationship with a number of women in the area, and some people have suggested that he may have had a connection to the murders. However, like many other suspects, there is no solid evidence to conclude that he was the Zodiac. The police investigated him several times and even targeted Kane, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. Furthermore, Kane had some strange characteristics, such as a sudden change in his personal life in the 1960s, which led many to suspect that he could be the Zodiac. But again, the lack of evidence makes Kane just one of many unconfirmed names. However, there is one detail that cannot be overlooked. Kane was an employee of a security service company, which gave him access to places that many others could not. People even began to hypothesize that Zodiac may have done the same job, using his role to kill people without raising suspicion. And that is one of the reasons why Kane remains on the list of suspects that the police cannot eliminate. However, to this day, after decades of investigation, he has not been concluded as the killer. Another interesting and notable suspicion involves Richard, a man who was convicted of actions related to the murders, but was not the Zodiac. Despite his normal appearance, Richard had a dark past, and many people suspect that he could be the Zodiac due to the similarities in the murder method. Some have theorized that Richard, like Zodiac, had a penchant for unconventional murder tools. Police investigated several men in the area after the Zodiac murders, but Richard became one of the unofficial suspects. Suspicions about him were based on similarities in the murder methods, with suspicious details, but not enough evidence to make a conclusion. The Zodiac case continues to stir the investigative community, with Richard being one of the names that many cannot dismiss. However, this has opened up another theory, that Zodiac was not a lone killer. Some believe that Zodiac may not have been just one person, but a group of killers operating in a similar manner. And so, finding the person behind Zodiac could be an extremely complicated task, because if it was indeed a group of people, they could have coordinated with each other to cover their tracks perfectly. There's a strange story that has been talked about for years about a neighbor of one of the victims, a person who many believe is connected to the cases. This person, who lived near the area where the first Zodiac murder took place, appeared in police investigations. His complicated relationships and strange behavior led many to believe that he could be the Zodiac. However, the police could not come to a definite conclusion about this person. Despite some shady relationships and suspicious signs, there was no clear evidence to convict. This neighbor, like many other suspects, became part of a larger story that could not be concluded definitively. That is one of the great mysteries in the Zodiac case. Are all the suspects innocent, or is Zodiac an extremely sophisticated person who knows how to blur his tracks? And most importantly, can we continue to find real clues to conclude about the killer who has sown this obsession on society? So, who is the real Zodiac? These suspects may be just shadows, fabricated stories, but are any of them really the killer we seek? In Zodiac Killer Mystery, Suspects and Clues True Crime Documentary, Part 3, we will continue to delve into the suspicions. In the hunt for the Zodiac Killer, the police not only had to deal with suspects, but also with a series of puzzling clues, strange traces, and obscure events that made them feel like they were chasing a shadow. This case was not just about a killer, but also about unanswered questions, inexplicable signs, and the inability of the legal system to catch the culprit. With each letter, each code sent, Zodiac not only bragged about the murders, but also created an unsolvable maze, making all the police's investigation efforts meaningless. Even the suspects that the police gradually targeted were just vague shadows. No one could be sure who was really behind the name Zodiac. So, did these clues really lead to the killer, or were they just traps set by the Zodiac to prolong this cat-and-mouse game? On a misty October morning in 1969, when San Francisco residents stepped out of their homes, they were confronted not only with the Zodiac's bloody letters, but also with the police's inability to deal with the traces he had left behind. The letters and codes were enough to tire the police, but now the suspicion that the Zodiac might have been planning a long-term plan, or even a game, complicated things even further. The police were faced not only with suspects, but also with the complexity of each case. Even if they had small pieces of evidence, they could never determine whether the traces left by the Zodiac were really his. The police were left facing a killer they could not catch, despite all the modern tools of the time. Mistakes in identification and searching for clues caused the case to drag on for years, and at times, some even thought that Zodiac would remain an untraceable ghost forever. One of the biggest mistakes the police made was not realizing that Zodiac was more than just an ordinary killer. He was a killer who knew how to exploit the media, manipulate public opinion, and perhaps even mislead investigations. And this made the search for him extremely difficult. He not only killed, but did everything he could to create confusion and chaos. While the Zodiac letters were terrifying, some of the clues in the cases seemed inexplicable. One of the strange details is that Zodiac may have used a gray car when traveling between crime scenes. Witnesses all described seeing a similar car, but because of the inaccuracy of the descriptions, the police could not determine whether that car was the one used by Zodiac. In subsequent investigations, interviews with people who lived near the crime scenes revealed another strange detail. Many people heard strange noises, but could not determine whether they were gunshots or just the noise of other vehicles. This made it even more difficult for the police to determine exactly when and how Zodiac committed the crimes. These details not only made the case difficult to investigate, but also created great ambiguity in identifying the perpetrator. Another clue was the victims of Zodiac. They were all people with no clear relationship to each other. From lovers to a taxi driver, there seems to be no obvious connection. This has led criminal psychologists to theorize that Zodiac may have chosen his victims at random, without any pattern, simply because he enjoyed the fear he caused. These theories have turned the case into a maze with no end in sight, and each clue only makes the police feel more helpless. As the Zodiac case has dragged on for so long without being solved, many theories have been put forward to explain his motives. One of the most popular theories is that Zodiac may have been someone who lived in the Bay Area and had an unknown criminal history. Details of previous cases, such as robberies and assaults, have created a connection between Zodiac and other criminals, although there is no clear evidence. He may have been a normal person, living among the crowd, but with a different nature and actions that only he understood. Some other theories suggest that Zodiac may have been a person with a long-standing grudge against society, against the authorities. Investigations into Zodiac's personal relationships show that he may have gone through a difficult period in his life, with special psychological experiences may have led to the crime. But whatever the theory, it all comes back to a single question. Was Zodiac a lone figure in the shadows, or part of a group of people involved in these crimes? Clue 4. The trace of crime. The traces of Zodiac's criminal behavior come not only from the murders, but also from the ways he sent letters and created codes. The police have realized that he was very intelligent, and there was clearly a thorough preparation in each case. The murders all have similarities. The victims were shot unexpectedly, and there are signs of great confidence on Zodiac's part. He did not fear when committing the cases. On the contrary, he did it as a way to show power. But it was because of that confidence that Zodiac left traces in his letters. The letters are full of challenges and sarcasm, with the clear intention of keeping the police from finding him. Zodiac knows that without the cooperation of the public, the case will never be solved. So he keeps laying down clues. But at the same time, he is also luring the police into a game they cannot win. So, who is the real Zodiac? Is it a loner, a man with clear clues but always evading the police's sights? In Zodiac Killer Mystery, Suspects and Clues, True Crime Documentary, Part 3, we will discover more about the suspects, the undisclosed events, and new clues. Perhaps all theories are just theories, but only when the truth is revealed, everything can be concluded. Don't miss it, because every clue brings us closer to the truth, and maybe even as the Zodiac letters continued to be sent, and as suspects were eliminated, the case became more and more complicated and confusing. Although the media and public were immersed in endless theories, and the police were still diligently turning over each card in the deck that Zodiac had laid out, the truth seemed far from certain. Zodiac was not just a killer, but a mind manipulator, a master of playing psychological games with the police and the public. But then, in the darkness of this case, there were big questions that remained unanswered. Paul Avery, a journalist known for his sharp and fearless writing, became one of the names rumored to be related to the Zodiac case. Avery was not a common suspect, but someone who had direct contact with Zodiac through his articles and letters to the newspaper. Many believe that the Zodiac may have been following Avery, or even sending letters to Avery with a specific purpose, to tease and challenge the journalist who had been pursuing the case. For a long time, Avery was the only person who had direct access to the Zodiac letters without interference. As a result, Avery soon became a target for curious people, even the police. He was not only a journalist, but also an important lead in the search for the Zodiac. However, the strange thing is that Avery was never really closely linked to the Zodiac, although his presence in the case was always a point of suspicion. The investigations could not go anywhere, and Avery always remained a shadow in the Zodiac case. In 1974, Avery suddenly suffered from a serious illness. Some believe it may have been a punishment from the Zodiac, while others believe it was simply a coincidence. However, no matter how it is explained, the fact remains that Avery never knew for sure whether the Zodiac was actually involved in his life. Although there is no hard evidence, Avery was part of the Zodiac's psychological game, and the uncertainty about Avery's connection to the case only makes it more confusing. One of the lesser-known but intriguing names in the Zodiac story is Jack Terrence, a man with a strange past who seemed to have a strong connection to the Zodiac murders. Terrence was not a prominent name in the initial investigation, but as investigators looked deeper into his past, they began to notice some suspicious patterns. Jack Terrence was a man with many complex lives, who worked in strange places and had relationships that could not be explained. Those around Terrence said that he had an unpredictable personality and that he moved from place to place for many years without any apparent reason. Interestingly, in a later interview, some people suggested that Terrence might have been involved in the Zodiac case because of his strange actions during the time of the murders. However, like many other suspects, there was not enough evidence to convict Terrence. Investigators still cannot determine whether he was actually involved in the murders. It is possible that Terrence was just an innocent man caught up in a story larger than himself, or he may be one of the names we do not know. All we know is that when the Zodiac case was investigated, the name Jack Terrence was dropped, and once again, we are faced with uncertainty about the true identity of the killer. Finally, there is another suspect that many believe is the Zodiac, but there is no clear conclusion. This person is not one of the most mentioned names, but someone who is not known to many, and all traces point to someone who likes to play the role of anonymity. His traces are difficult to determine, but many believe that he played an important role in creating the unexplained murders. It is safe to say that, in the Zodiac case, there is no suspect who can be proven completely right or wrong. Each person has a story, each suspect has details that make them part of the game that the Zodiac created. However, one thing is certain. These suspects are not simple characters in this story. Each name makes us wonder whether Zodiac was truly a lone wolf, or if he created a strange web to hide his crimes. So who is the Zodiac? Each suspect, each clue opens up new stories, but is any of them really the killer we seek? In Zodiac Killer Mystery, Suspects and Clues, True Crime Documentary, Part 3, we will continue to delve into the doubts, unexplained clues, and other suspects in this story. Don't miss it. We will get closer to the final answer, and maybe we will finally discover who is. The 1970s opened in the obscurity of the Zodiac case. A highly sophisticated killer had drawn the entire society into the game he had created. It was not just blood, not just murders, but a long, endless psychological war. The police, despite their powerful forces and the support of experts, were constantly pushed to a dead end, unable to catch the culprit. The Zodiac's letters became more and more mysterious. The traces were blurred, and each clue led to different directions, but none of them were strong enough to convict him. The police spent years investigating, but still could not get close to any solid clues. The suspects, the statements, and even the tools they collected, all were not strong enough to clear the case. Zodiac was so clever at covering his tracks that the police could not find his trail. The police, from the first people involved in the investigation to the experts, were all exhausted. The complexity of the case was not only in the murders, but also in the letters, the codes, and the ostentation of Zodiac. Time passed, and the case seemed to fall into oblivion, although no one could forget the name Zodiac. Every time the public thought the case was about to be solved, Zodiac sent a letter, forcing the police to start over again. The letters were not just messages about the murders. They were games that Zodiac played, challenging the investigators, threatening that he would continue killing until he was caught, and even mocking the incompetence of the police. Each letter was a taunt, each code a cruel joke that made the investigators' work hopeless. Every piece of information they received led to a dead end. The public was not spared the nightmare that Zodiac brought. His letters not only gave the police a headache, but also made the entire society afraid. People were not only worried about the murders, but they also had to face a terrible psychological game. Every time a letter was sent to the newspaper, people stopped to read to guess what Zodiac would say next, whether he would really kill. And when he threatened to kill again, each citizen felt that he could be the next victim. Some say that if the public had not participated in Zodiac's game, perhaps the case would not have become such a legend. But in reality, his letters were not just messages of death, but also indictments of society's incompetence. A killer not only uses a knife, he also uses words to challenge everything. And when society begins to be drawn into that game, it becomes an endless nightmare from which no one can escape. Stories about Zodiac began to flood the media. TV shows, interviews, and articles all mention the case. Every time there was new information, people were excited. They wanted to know more about Zodiac. They wanted to understand him. And some even began to see him as a legendary figure, a symbol of cunning and adventure. But what they didn't realize was that they were helping him, making this killer more famous than ever. In the mid-1970s, a number of experts became involved in analyzing the letters and codes sent by Zodiac. They were the ones who tried to find clues in the smallest details of his letters. Some experts believe that Zodiac may have been a very intelligent person, a cunning and great manipulator. In fact, Zodiac chose to send letters to the press and publicize the details of his murders, not just to brag, but also to continue to attract attention. One of the most notable clues that experts discovered was the symbols that Zodiac used in his letters. He often drew circles, strange symbols, and always ended with the word Zodiac. Experts tried to understand these symbols, and some theorized that these symbols were not just jokes, but messages about something bigger. Perhaps the Zodiac was trying to convey a hidden message that only special people could understand. Some psychologists even believe that the Zodiac's actions could be the result of a huge ego, a person who likes to manipulate and make others feel afraid. A killer does not just kill to satisfy his instincts, but also kills to assert his power, to show what he can do with the lives of others. The Zodiac, with his letters and codes, seems to be building an empire of fear. The police have faced a long psychological battle. Although they have full tools, equipment, and support from experts, but they still could not catch Zodiac. The murders continued, and each time, Zodiac sent a letter, making the investigation hopeless. The police began to feel helpless, not only because they could not find the killer, but also because they could not guess his motive. Zodiac was not a normal criminal. He not only killed people, but also played a game, making the case an endless nightmare. And that made the police unable to find a solution to this problem. They tried to find clues, suspects, but all the experiments and hypotheses failed. Zodiac was not just a killer. He was a game player and made everyone participate. So the question is, can Zodiac be caught, or will he continue to live in the dark forever? In Zodiac Killer Investigation, Police Stalemate True Crime Documentary, Part 4, we will enter the arduous investigation phase of the police and the steps closer to finding the killer. Don't miss it, because the story of Zodiac has never been as easy as you think. Stay tuned for the next part, where the clues will be revealed and we will get closer to the final answer to the Zodiac Killer case.